So we've discussed how to factor trinomials if the leading coefficient of the trinomial is a 1. What I want to do in this video is talk about how to factor these trinomials if your leading coefficient is something other than 1. Let's look at an example. 2x squared minus 5x minus 3. Just like with our other trinomials, when we're finished factoring, we should end up with two binomials multiplied by each other. In other words, there should be two terms in this set of parentheses and two terms here as well. I'm going to do this problem using the guess and check technique. And in reality, we're doing a little bit more than just guessing. We're using a bit of logic too. So the first question I would ask is, what two things can we multiply here and here that would give us 2x squared? In the past, our answer was x and x. But since we need our a value, or our leading coefficient, to be 2, one of these is going to have a 2 on it if we're able to factor it. Okay, great. Well, the next question you ask is, well, what can go here and here? Well, our answers are pretty limited because our last two terms need to multiply together to get -3. So we could have a combination of plus or minus 3 and 1 in these two blanks. We're just going to throw out a random guess. I'll put a 3 here and a 1 here. Let's call this a negative and let's call this a positive. And the check step is usually multiplying out in our head or writing it down on paper. These two binomials to see if we get the trinomial that we started with in the first place. Now if we multiplied this out, we'd get 2x squared plus 2x minus 3x minus 3. And the question is that the same thing as the trinomial we started with? It's not, because when we combine these two terms together, we don't get -5x. What we have to do is make a little bit of a better guess. And that means changing these two numbers right here. Let's take another stab at it. Let's say we put a +3 here and a -1. Notice that one of these has to be negative and one of them has to be positive in order for the 3 to be negative here. Let's check this one. We get 2x squared. We get outer two terms give us +6x. Inner two terms give us -x minus 3. We get the correct first term and the correct last term, but the question is, do these inner two terms add up to -5x? They actually add up to +5x. Which suggests that we just got our signs wrong. So all we need to do now is go in and change our sign. So that one's negative and that one's positive. And now when we check by multiplying this thing out, we get 2x squared minus 6x plus x minus 3. That's the one that's going to work. So that is how we factor that trinomial. Now, in reality, it usually doesn't take this long. What you'll typically do is do the check step in your head and come up with that answer fairly quickly. But this guess and check technique doesn't sit well with everybody. So I'll give you the other option. The other option is factoring by grouping. I tend to use factoring by grouping when I have a little bit of trouble guessing and checking. I can't quite come up with the right answer. So let's do it. I'm going to rewrite the trinomial, and here's the technique. You're going to take the a value, the leading coefficient, and the c value, and you're going to multiply them together. In this case, when you do that, you get -6. Now I'm going to list all the possible numbers that multiplied to get -6. I think that list is complete. Now the question we ask when factoring these trinomials by grouping is, which of these pairs adds to the middle term? Or in other words, which pair is going to add to our b value? Well, this pair right here, 1 minus 6, those add up to -5. Okay, now that we have those two numbers, what we're going to do is we're going to copy down the first term, we're going to leave some space, I'm going to copy down the last term, and we're going to rewrite this middle term, this b term, using the coefficients that we circled over here. That was a totally legal maneuver because we just rewrote -5x as x minus 6x. It's a true statement. Now here's the grouping part. We're going to take these first two terms here and we're going to factor out what we can from just those first two terms. And I noticed from these first two terms that I can factor out an x. Now we're going to look at these last two terms and we're going to factor what we can out of those last two terms. And it looks to me like you can factor a -3 out of each one of these two terms, leaving you with 2x plus 1. Now this is where something magical has happened, because look at these two terms we have left. We have this term here, and we have this term here. They each have a 2x plus 1 in them. And since each term has a factor of 2x plus 1 in it, we can actually factor that out. I'll put it out here. 2x plus 1, we are going to factor out of this term. And when we do that, what we're left with is just an x. If we factor the 2x plus 1 out of this term right here, what we're left with is just a -3. Now look what we ended up with. We ended up with 2x plus 1 times x minus 3, which is the exact same thing that we got by guessing and checking. So that is the correct way to factor the trinomial. Now you get to decide which of these techniques you like the best, guess and check, or factoring by grouping. Personally, I use a mixture of the two. I try to guess and check for a couple of minutes first. If I can't figure it out, I'll go to factoring by grouping because it seems to work every time, and it's a step-by-step process. But if you can guess and check, it's probably going to save you some time. Okay, I'm going to leave this video here. Be sure to complete the worksheet that goes along with this video, and I'll see you guys in class.